476 CE, a 23-year-old mathematician named Aryabhata stares at the night sky from Kusumapura and realizes something that will get him called insane. The Earth is spinning, not the heavens rotating around us like every scholar, every priest, every ancient text has said for 1,000 years. No, the Earth itself is turning like a potter's wheel, and we're all just passengers hurtling through space at incomprehensible speed. Here's his dilemma. If he publishes this, he'll be challenging the cosmic order. If he stays silent, he's a coward who discovered the truth and buried it. While Rome collapses into warlords and darkness, medieval India is about to prove something: that the greatest rebellions, whether intellectual or political, come from people willing to be called insane. This is the story of medieval India through two impossible rebels: a mathematician who discovered Earth rotates, and a warrior queen who defied every law of succession. It starts with Aryabhata, but it doesn't end with him. Here's what you need to understand about Aryabhata. He wasn't working in some isolated monastery. Kusumapura, modern-day Patna, was the intellectual heart of the Gupta Empire, basically the Silicon Valley of the 5th century. The university there had students from Persia, from Southeast Asia, from places that don't exist anymore. And Aryabhata looked at the tools they had, the astronomy, the mathematics inherited from Babylon and Greece, and thought, this is wrong. All of it. The prevailing model said the heavens rotated around Earth. Every observation, every religious text, every diagram drawn in the sand supported this. It felt true. When you watch the sun cross the sky, it looks like it's moving, right? But Aryabhata found something in the numbers: a wobble, an inconsistency in how planets moved that only made sense if Earth itself was rotating. He calculated the Earth's circumference. He was off by only 70 kilometers in the 5th century, using nothing but shadows and geometry. So he publishes. He writes the Aryabhata, a mathematical text that introduces the concept of zero as a number, explains how to calculate square roots and cube roots, and casually mentions that the Earth rotates on its axis. The response? Immediate backlash. Other scholars call him a heretic. Religious authorities say he's undermining cosmic order. His own students start arguing with him. Because here's the thing. Aryabhata didn't just challenge astronomy. He challenged the entire way Indians understood their place in the universe. But wait, here's what happens with ideas that are actually true. They don't die, they spread. Within a generation, Indian mathematicians are using his base 10 system, his trigonometric functions, his algorithms. Arab scholars will later translate his work and call it al-Khwarizmi, which gives us the word algorithm. European mathematicians won't catch up for 500 years. Aryabhata created an intellectual explosion. Suddenly, Indian scholars aren't just preserving ancient knowledge. They're inventing new mathematics, new astronomy, new ways of understanding reality itself. Universities pop up across the subcontinent. Nalanda becomes the largest learning center in the world, with 10,000 students in a library that supposedly burned for 3 months when it was eventually destroyed. Indian numerals, the system we all use today, spread to the Middle East, then to Europe. Every time you write 7 instead of 7, you're using Aryabhata's inheritance. But mathematics doesn't exist in a vacuum. While Aryabhata calculated the cosmos, someone had to build the world. Enter Vishvakarma, not the god, the profession. The temple architects and engineers who took mathematical principles and transformed them into stone. Here's what this looked like. It's 550 CE. You're a master architect tasked with building a temple to Shiva in a village that barely appears on maps. You don't have cranes, You don't have power tools, you have ropes, wooden scaffolding, and mathematical precision passed down through generations. And here's the crazy part. You use Aryabhata's calculations, the geometry, the measurements, the understanding of weight distribution, to create structures that will stand for 1,500 years. The temples at Mahabalipuram, the cave complexes at Ellora, carved directly into volcanic rock. These aren't just buildings, they're mathematical proofs rendered in stone. Which raises a question that's haunted historians for centuries. Why do some civilizations innovate while others stagnate? Look, it's not resources. Rome had plenty of resources when it collapsed. It's not population. China had massive populations, but experienced periods of technological plateau. Here's what India had during this period: intellectual freedom combined with economic prosperity. The Gupta Empire and the kingdoms that followed didn't just tolerate scholars. They funded them. They built universities. They copied texts. They invited foreign mathematicians to debate Indian ones. Here's the thing about innovation. It needs oxygen. It needs people who can afford to think about problems that don't have immediate practical solutions. Aryabhata wasn't calculating the Earth's rotation because someone paid him to improve crop yields. He did it because he could. And this matters because while Europe spent the early Middle Ages forgetting how to make concrete, Indian scholars were pushing into territories no one had mapped. They developed early concepts of infinity. They created sophisticated medical texts on surgery, including plastic surgery techniques that wouldn't reach Europe until the 18th century. They built irrigation systems and calculated planetary movements with precision that wouldn't be matched until the telescope was invented. This wasn't some utopia. There were wars, famines, droughts, political chaos. But through it all, the intellectual tradition survived because it was decentralized. Knowledge wasn't locked in one monastery or one library. It was spread across dozens of kingdoms, hundreds of universities, thousands of scholars. Then the Arab invasions began. 711 CE, Muhammad bin Qasim conquers Sindh, the northwestern region of the Indian subcontinent. And unlike previous invaders who came to plunder and leave, the Arabs came to stay. Now here's where the story gets complicated, because this isn't a simple tale of destruction. The Arabs brought their own mathematical traditions, inherited from Greek and Persian sources. When they encountered Indian mathematics, something unexpected happened: synthesis. Indian numerals traveled west. Arab astronomy techniques traveled east. The number 0, Aryabhata's conceptual child, became the foundation of Islamic mathematics. Al-Khwarizmi, the Persian mathematician, literally wrote the book on Indian numerals, spreading them throughout the Islamic world. But wait, synthesis requires stability. And by 1200 CE, that stability was crumbling. The Delhi Sultanate established Muslim rule over northern India. Universities burned. Libraries were destroyed. The great intellectual centers that had flourished for centuries faced existential threat. But here's what the history books often miss. While northern India descended into chaos, southern India was building its own golden age. The Chola dynasty in Tamil Nadu became a naval superpower, conquering territory as far as Southeast Asia. Their temple architects, the inheritors of Vishvakarma's tradition, built structures so mathematically precise that they've survived earthquakes that leveled modern buildings. And in this fragmented landscape of competing kingdoms and cultural collision, one person emerged who would become the symbol of Indian resistance to invasion. Her name was Rudrama Devi, and look, she had a problem that would make Aryabhata's challenges look quaint. Because while Aryabhata only had to fight ideas, Rudrama had to fight biology itself, or at least what everyone believed biology meant for power. 1262 CE, a 14-year-old girl named Rudrama sits in the court of the Kakatiya dynasty and listens to her father, King Ganapati Deva, make an announcement that will shatter every rule of succession. He has no sons. She will rule, not as regent, not as a placeholder, as king. The silence in that throne room must have been deafening, because what Ganapati Deva just proposed wasn't just unconventional, it was civilizational heresy. Medieval Indian law codes were explicit. Women could own property, manage estates, even wield influence behind the scenes. But rule as king, command armies, make life and death decisions about war and peace? The Dharma Shastras, the law texts, literally said no. But wait, Ganapati Deva looked at his teenage daughter and saw something the law codes couldn't account for. Competence, intelligence, steel. So he made a bet that would either save his dynasty or destroy it. Here's what this means. Medieval India had queens before, usually widows ruling until a male heir came of age. But Ganapati Deva was declaring that his daughter would be crowned king, use male titles, dress in male clothing, and command armies in battle. The court erupted, not in celebration, in revolt. Feudatory lords who'd sworn allegiance to Ganapati Deva stood up and walked out. Neighboring kingdoms sent ambassadors with a simple message: we don't recognize this succession. Choose a male heir or face war. Even within the palace, the resistance was immediate. Court priests cited scripture. Military commanders questioned whether soldiers would follow a woman into battle. Ministers worried about marriage alliances. What king would marry his son to a ruling queen? What kingdom would accept her children as legitimate heirs? Rudrama, a 14-year-old who'd been raised in silk and ceremony, suddenly faced a choice that would define everything that followed. Back down and watch her father's kingdom collapse into civil war as rivals fought over the throne, or become something that shouldn't exist. She chose the impossible. So she trained, not in secret, not in the shadows, publicly, deliberately, making sure every rival kingdom knew she was preparing for war. She learned sword fighting, cavalry tactics, siege warfare. She studied the military campaigns of her ancestors, the Chalukyas and Rashtrakutas, who had defended southern India for centuries. She read texts on statecraft and diplomacy, on how to turn enemies against each other, how to forge alliances that would hold. And when she was crowned in 1263, she sent a message to every neighboring kingdom. She was not her father's daughter pretending to be king. She was king. Challenge her and find out what that meant. The challenges came immediately. The Yadavas from the north, the Pandyas from the south, the Kakatiya's own feudatories, local lords who'd paid tribute to her father, declared independence, betting that a woman couldn't hold the kingdom together. They were wrong, but here's the deeper question. What do we believe in? Not philosophically, practically. When Rudrama's nobles looked at her, they saw a woman in male clothing claiming a man's title. When her enemies looked at her, they saw weakness. When her soldiers looked at her, they had to choose. Do we follow tradition or do we follow power? Here's Rudrama's bet. Legitimacy comes from results, not bloodline, not gender, not divine right, results. So she gave them results. 1268 CE. The Yadava king Mahadeva invades from the north with a massive army, expecting the Kakatiya kingdom to collapse. Rudrama met him at Kolanupaka. Here's what we know from inscriptions. She led the cavalry charge personally, not from the rear, not from a command tent, She was at the front, visible, undeniable. Her cavalry smashed through the Yadava flanks, while her infantry held the center. Mahadeva retreated, not because he was defeated, his army was still intact, but because Rudrama had shattered the illusion of weakness. She'd proven that her army would fight for her, that her generals would follow her into battle, that she was willing to die for her kingdom. Here's the message that spread. The Kakatiya kingdom was not collapsing, it was fighting back. Over the next 30 years, Rudrama fought war after war, against the Yadavas, against the Pandyas, against rebellious nobles who kept testing whether she was truly as formidable as the stories claimed. She won most of them, lost some. The inscriptions from her reign, carved in stone across southern India, tell of battles fought, territories reclaimed, temples built in victory. But here's the thing, they also tell another story of a person who had to constantly prove their right to exist. Every victory was scrutinized, every loss was magnified. Male kings could afford to be incompetent. Indian history is full of mediocre kings who ruled for decades without achieving anything. Rudrama couldn't afford a single failure without her entire reign being questioned. She married a strategic alliance, but took a subordinate husband, maintaining her position as king. She administered justice, reformed the tax system, patronized temples and poets. She did everything a good medieval king was supposed to do. And look, it still wasn't enough for her critics. The inscriptions from her later reign start to change. Less boasting about victories, more emphasis on dharma, duty, cosmic order, the proper way of being. It's like she was trying to justify herself not through military success, but through moral righteousness. She ruled until 1289 or 1295. The exact date is disputed. She may have died in battle, fighting the Pandyas to the very end, or she may have abdicated to her grandson and died in peace. The sources disagree, but here's what matters. After her death, the Kakatiya dynasty survived another 50 years before finally falling to the Delhi Sultanate. Rudrama had bought them time. She'd proven that the kingdom could survive, could fight, could maintain itself against existential threats. She'd done what kings are supposed to do. So let's zoom out. What are we actually talking about here? Aryabhata discovered that the Earth rotates, and in doing so, he shifted how an entire civilization understood reality. Rudrama Devi defied gender norms, and in doing so, she shifted what her kingdom believed was possible. Here's the pattern. Both of them were rebels. Both challenged their society's deepest assumptions. Both paid a price for it, Aryabhata in intellectual backlash, Rudrama in having to constantly justify her existence. But here's what matters. Both also left legacies that outlasted their critics. Which brings us to the final question. What gives life meaning? Not in some abstract sense, but in the medieval Indian context. Both Aryabhata and Rudrama lived in societies obsessed with dharma, with duty, with cosmic order, with playing the role you were assigned. Aryabhata was supposed to study the old texts and preserve ancient wisdom. Instead, he questioned everything and created new knowledge. Rudrama was supposed to marry well and produce heirs. Instead, she became king and commanded armies. Here's what they figured out. They found meaning not in following the script, but in writing new ones. And maybe that's the real lesson of medieval India, that the greatest innovations, whether mathematical or political, come from people willing to challenge the assumption that things have to be the way they've always been. Medieval India wasn't a footnote. It was a golden age of intellectual and cultural achievement that shaped the modern world in ways we barely acknowledge. The numbers you use? Indian. The concept of zero? Indian. The base 10 system that makes all modern mathematics possible? Indian. And yet, when we think of medieval history, we think of European knights and castles. We think of Islamic scholars in Baghdad. We rarely think of the mathematicians in Kusumapura or the warrior queens in Warangal. Here's the thing, that's changing slowly, because the more you dig into medieval history beyond Europe, the more you realize that the Dark Ages were only dark in one part of the world. Everywhere else, the lights were on and people were doing remarkable things. Speaking of remarkable things, next video, we're going to Africa, specifically to the richest man who ever lived, Mansa Musa of Mali, whose legendary pilgrimage to Mecca was so extravagant that he accidentally crashed the Egyptian economy. Look, if you thought Indian mathematicians and warrior queens were impressive, wait until you hear about the king who gave away so much gold that he caused inflation across 3 continents. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it. And if you made it this far, drop a comment. Would you rather fight 1 Rudrama Devi-sized duck or 100 duck-sized Rudrama Devis? I need to know. See you in the next one.